The candle flickered in the cabin window like a dying breath against the endless black of the Indiana wilderness, and Samuel Harrow knew that someone inside was already dead. He had been walking for 3 days through forests so thick that daylight barely touched the ground, carrying nothing but his father's hunting rifle and a letter that had arrived at their homestead in Pennsylvania 6 weeks too late. The letter spoke of opportunity, of fertile land, and a warm welcome from his brother Ezekiel, who had ventured west 2 years prior to claim his piece of the American dream. But dreams in 1802 had a way of turning into nightmares, especially in territories where civilization was just a word whispered around dying campfires. The Harrow homestead sat in a clearing that felt wrong somehow, as if the trees had been forced back rather than cleared. The logs were dark with age or something else, and smoke curled from the chimney in a way that seemed too thick, too black for an ordinary fire. Samuel approached slowly, his boots crunching on ground that was littered with bones, animal bones, he told himself, though some seemed too long, too curved to belong to any deer or rabbit. The door opened before he could knock, and there stood his brother Ezekiel. But the man in the doorway was not the Ezekiel who had left Pennsylvania with bright eyes and plans for the future. This Ezekiel was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and his eyes held a hunger that made Samuel's stomach twist. With unease, brother Ezekiel said, and his voice was like rustling leaves, dry and brittle. You came, I got your letter, Samuel replied, though something in his brother's expression made him grip his rifle tighter. It said you needed help with the harvest. Ezekiel smiled, and Samuel noticed that his teeth seemed sharper than they should be. Yes, the harvest, he said. Come inside, Martha has prepared supper. Samuel had never heard of anyone named Martha in any of Ezekiel's letters, but he followed his brother into the cabin. The interior was lit by too many candles, creating dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of any flame. A woman stood by the fireplace, and when she turned, Samuel saw a face that might have been beautiful once, but now carried marks of something terrible. Dark circles ringed her eyes like bruises, and her smile revealed teeth stained red, as if she had been eating berries or something else entirely. She wore a dress that had once been fine but now hung in tatters, and when she moved, Samuel caught the scent of something sweet and rottenness. Is Martha? Ezekiel said, wrapping his arm around the woman's waist in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. She keeps house for us now? Samuel asked, looking around the cabin and noticing for the first time that there were more shadows than there should be, shapes that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at them. The others, Ezekiel said, and gestured toward a doorway covered by a heavy curtain. They are resting, but you will meet them tomorrow. We have quite a family here now, Samuel. Quite a family indeed. Martha moved to a pot hanging over the fire and began ladling something into wooden bowls. The smell that rose from whatever she was serving made Samuel's mouth water despite his unease. But there was an undertone to it, something metallic and sharp that reminded him of the taste of blood. Sit, brother, Ezekiel said, guiding Samuel to a rough wooden table. You must be hungry after your journey. Samuel sat but kept his rifle across his lap. The cabin felt smaller now, as if the walls were pressing inward, and he noticed that the windows had been boarded up from the inside, heavy planks nailed across the glass as if to keep something out, or perhaps to keep something in. Martha placed a bowl before him, and Samuel looked down at the thick, dark stew floating with chunks of meat that could have been anything. The smell was overwhelming now, sweet and rich and wrong in ways he couldn't name. Eat, Ezekiel urged, and Samuel noticed that neither his brother nor Martha had bowls of their own. They just watched him with eyes that gleamed too bright in the candlelight. Samuel lifted the spoon, but as he did, he heard something that made his blood freeze. A sound from beyond the curtained doorway, not quite human, but not quite animal. Either a whimpering that might have been crying, or might have been something else entirely. What was that? Samuel asked, lowering the spoon. Nothing, Ezekiel said too quickly. Just the wind. But there was no wind. The night outside was perfectly still, and the sound came again, longer this time, more desperate. Samuel stood so quickly that his chair toppled backward, and Martha hissed like a cat startled from sleep. I think I should camp outside tonight, Samuel said, backing toward the door. Thank you for the meal, but you cannot leave, Ezekiel said, and his voice had changed, becoming something darker and hungrier. You have come so far, brother, and Martha has worked so hard. Preparing the feast, the curtain moved, and Samuel saw a pale hand emerge, fingers too long and nails too sharp. Martha began to laugh, a sound like breaking glass, and the candles flickered as if something had passed between them and the flame. Samuel ran. He burst through the door and into the clearing, but the darkness seemed to follow him, pressing close and full of whispers. Behind him he could hear Ezekiel calling his name, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the trees and the sky. He stumbled through the forest, guided only by starlight and the desperate need to put distance between himself and whatever his brother had become. The trees seemed to reach for him, with branches like grasping fingers and more. Then once he thought he heard footsteps behind him, matching his pace, but always staying just out of sight. When dawn finally broke, Samuel found himself at the edge of a small settlement, no more than a handful of cabins and a general store. The people who lived there were hard frontier folk, weathered by years of surviving in the wilderness. But when Samuel asked about the Harrow homestead, their faces went pale. Nobody goes to that place, one old woman told him. That land is cursed, has been since the Whitmore family disappeared last spring. What happened to them? Samuel asked, though part of him already knew. He didn't want to hear the answer. They went to help with something, the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. Some kind of harvest. Ezekiel Harrow said he needed extra hands for the work. Samuel felt the world tilt around him. How many people? 7 souls, the woman replied, including 2 children. Nobody ever saw them again, and when the sheriff went to investigate, all he found was an empty homestead and strange marks in the dirt. Marks like something had been dragged. As the woman spoke, Samuel realized that the taste of that metallic sweetness was still in his mouth, and his stomach churned with the horrible understanding of what Martha might have been cooking in that pot, what his brother had become in those 2 years of isolation, and what was waiting for him back at the homestead, even now, probably preparing for another harvest, another family to welcome with candlelight and smiles and bowls of stew that should never be eaten. The sun climbed higher, but Samuel could not shake the feeling that somewhere in those dark woods, his brother was still calling his name, still waiting for him to come home to the family. 3 days later, Samuel found himself standing in the doorway of Sheriff Cornelius Blackwood's office, clutching a bottle of whiskey and fighting the urge to run back to Pennsylvania. But the faces of the missing Whitmore children haunted his dreams. The sheriff was a mountain of a man with hands like ham hocks and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. But when Samuel mentioned the Harrow homestead, Blackwood's weathered face went white as fresh snow. You're Ezekiel's brother, the sheriff said, pouring himself a generous measure of the whiskey Samuel had brought. I wondered when you'd show up. Samuel sat in the chair across from the desk, which creaked ominously under his weight. Tell me about the Whitmores. Blackwood drained his glass and poured another. Good people, he said. John Whitmore was a blacksmith, had strong arms and an honest face. His wife Patience could birth a calf in a thunderstorm and make it seem easy. They had 2 young ones. Tom was age 8 and little Anna barely 5 years old. What happened to them? The sheriff was quiet for so long that Samuel began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. They went to help your brother with something he called the autumn gathering. Said he needed extra hands for a special harvest that would feed them all through the winter. Samuel felt that familiar metallic taste creeping back into his mouth. What kind of harvest? That's what I want to find out, Blackwood said, but when he looked up, his eyes held a haunted quality that Samuel recognized from looking in mirrors after nightmares. I rode out there with 2 deputies, thinking we'd find them working the fields or maybe helping to build a new barn, but you didn't know. We didn't. The sheriff stood and walked to the window, looking out at the small settlement, as if reassuring himself that normal life still existed. What we found was something else entirely. Samuel waited, his hands clenched into fists. The homestead looked normal. From a distance, Blackwood continued. Smoke from the chimney, horses in the paddock, even laundry hanging on the line. But when we got closer, we could see that something was wrong. The horses were thin, like they hadn't been fed properly. And that laundry had been hanging too long, some of it starting to rot on the line. "Where was my brother inside?" the sheriff said, and his voice dropped even lower. "Your brother came out to meet us, and he seemed friendly enough at first. Asked how he could help us, said he hadn't seen the Whitmores in weeks, but you didn't believe him." The sheriff turned from the window, and Samuel saw something in his expression that made his blood run cold. It wasn't that I didn't believe him exactly. It was the smell, what smelled like a smokehouse. Blackwood said, but sweeter somehow, richer, the kind of smell that gets into your clothes and stays there for days after you leave. Samuel's stomach churned. "Tell me the rest." We asked to search the property, and your brother agreed readily enough. Too readily, if you ask me. He walked us around, showing us the fields, the barn, the root cellar, everything looked normal, but that smell kept getting stronger. Sheriff sat back down and poured another drink, his hands shaking slightly. "In the root cellar we found barrels." Blackwood continued, "Lots of barrels, all sealed tight." When I asked what was in them, your brother said it was preserved meat for the winter venison he claimed from a good hunting season. "You didn't open them." I tried. The sheriff's voice broke slightly, "But your brother said the meat would spoil if we let air in. Said we could come back in spring if we still had questions about the Whitmore." Samuel leaned forward, sensing there was more. "But one of my deputies, young Tom Garrett, he was curious boy, always was. When your brother wasn't looking, Tom pried open one of those barrel lids just enough to peek inside." The sheriff stopped talking, and Samuel had to prompt him. "What did he see?" Blackwood drained his glass and stared at the bottom, as if searching for answers there. "Tom never told me exactly what he saw in that barrel. But when we left the homestead, he was pale as death and shaking like a leaf in a windstorm. 2 days later he left town. Said he was going back east to live with relatives. He never said anything." The sheriff met Samuel's eyes, and in that gaze was a terrible knowledge. "Only one thing. Tom said he was riding out of town, that if he ever saw another barrel of pickled meat in his life, it would be too soon." Silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Samuel finally found his voice. "Where is Deputy Garrett?" "Now dead," Blackwood said flatly. "Died 3 weeks after he left town. Horse threw him into a ravine. At least that's what the letter from his cousin said." I always wondered what if Tom really died from that fall, or if something else caught up with him, something that didn't want him talking about what he saw in those barrels. Samuel stood and began pacing the small office. The floorboards groaned under his feet like old bones. "You think my brother killed thee Whitmore? Think your brother has become something that ain't quite human anymore," the sheriff said, and there was finality in his voice. "I think he's found a way to survive out there in that wilderness that decent folk wouldn't understand, and I think anyone who gets too close to figuring out his secret ends up disappearing." "Then why haven't you done anything about it?" Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What would I do?" Samuel arrest him for what? Having barrels in his root cellar. Killing a deputy I can't prove died from anything other than a horse accident. Making people disappear when I can't even prove they're really gone. Samuel stopped pacing. "You're afraid of him." Sheriff's honesty was brutal. "Yes, I'm afraid of him. I've seen things in 30 years of keeping law in this territory that would turn your hair white. But your brother Samuel, there's something about him now that makes every instinct I have scream run, as if summoned by their conversation." A knock came at the office door. Both men froze, and Samuel felt his heart hammering against his ribs. The knock came again, patient but insistent. "Come in," Blackwood called, though his hand moved instinctively to the pistol on his belt. The door opened, and Martha stepped into the office, the same woman Samuel had seen at the homestead. But somehow she looked different in daylight, less human if that was possible. Her skin had a waxy quality, and when she smiled her teeth seemed to have grown sharper. "Hello, Sheriff," she said in a voice like honey poured over broken glass. "Ezekiel sent me to town for supplies. He wanted me to give you his regards." Samuel tried to make himself smaller in his chair, hoping she wouldn't notice him. But Martha's gaze found him immediately. And her smile widened, "And Samuel," she said as if greeting an old friend, "how lovely to see you again. Ezekiel has been asking about you, wondering when you'll come back to visit." "I won't be coming back," Samuel managed to say. Martha tilted her head like a curious bird studying prey. "Oh, but you will," she said with absolute certainty. "We're family now, and family always comes home in the end." She turned back to the sheriff, who hadn't moved a muscle since she entered. "Ezekiel wanted me to thank you for being so understanding about the Whitmore situation. He knows how hard it must be for you not knowing what happened to them." "I know exactly what happened to them," the sheriff said quietly. Martha's smile never wavered. "Of course you do," she said. "But knowing and proving are two different things, aren't they, Sheriff? And besides, the Whitmores are very happy where they are now. They've become part of something bigger than themselves." With that, she turned and glided from the office, leaving behind only that sweet, sick smell and the sound of Samuel's ragged breathing. Sheriff waited until her footsteps faded before speaking. She knows what Samuel whispered, "that we're planning something," Blackwood said, reaching for his rifle, "that we're not going to let this continue." Samuel stared at the doorway where Martha had disappeared, feeling as if he'd just been marked for death. But what choice did they have? The harvest was coming, and somewhere in those dark woods, his brother was preparing to reap what he had sown. That night Samuel dreamed of children's voices calling from beneath the earth, and woke to find blood under his fingernails, though he couldn't remember scratching anything. The morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Kea settlement, an itinerant preacher named Josiah Crane, whose wild eyes and trembling hands spoke of a man who had seen too much of the devil's work. Crane had been traveling the frontier territories for months, warning settlements about what he called the spreading darkness. But when he heard about the Harrow homestead, his weathered face went ashen, and he gripped Samuel's arm with fingers like iron claws. "The brother," he whispered, and Samuel could smell whiskey and fear on the old man's breath. "I've been searching for someone who would listen, someone who would believe." Believe what? Samuel asked, though part of him already knew he wouldn't like the answer. "That your brother didn't just lose his mind out there in the wilderness," Crane said, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "He found something ancient and hungry, something that's been waiting in these woods since before the first white man set foot on this soil." Preacher led Samuel to a quiet corner of the settlement's small church, a log building that smelled of pine sap and desperate prayers. Crane pulled out a leather journal filled with cramped handwriting and crude sketches. "I've been tracking this thing for 2 years," he said, flipping through pages covered with maps and newspaper clippings. "It moved from settlement to settlement, never staying in one place too long, always finding isolated families, people who won't be missed right away." Samuel studied the journal entries, each one describing disappearances that followed the same pattern: a helpful neighbor offering assistance, a special harvest or gathering that required extra hands, families who went to help and were never seen again. "How many?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. 17 families, Crane said, and his voice cracked with the weight of it. 63 souls, including 22 children. The youngest was only 3 years old. The preacher turned to a page near the back of his journal, and Samuel saw a crude drawing that made his blood freeze. It showed a creature that might once have been human, but had been twisted into something else. Entirely elongated limbs, razor-sharp teeth, and eyes that held an intelligence both ancient and utterly malevolent. "This is what I saw in Ohio," Crane whispered, 3 months ago. "I came upon a homestead where the screaming had stopped, but the smell remained. I found the cellar." Samuel found what was left of the Morrison family. Samuel couldn't bring himself to ask for details, but Crane continued anyway, his voice taking on the cadence of a man reciting a nightmare. "They had been drained," he said, "not just of blood, but of something deeper, something that made them human. The bodies looked like empty husks, like discarded clothes, after the person inside had simply evaporated." "What does it want?" Samuel managed to ask. "To feed," Crane replied, "but not just on flesh. It feeds on suffering, on the slow dissolution of everything that makes us human. It doesn't just kill." Samuel, "It transforms changes its victims into something like itself. Samuel thought of his brother's sharp teeth, of Martha's waxy skin, and felt his stomach lurch. You think Ezekiel is one of these things. I think your brother was the first victim, Crane said gently. Thing that lives in those woods. It needed someone local, someone trusted, a face that neighbors would recognize and welcome into their homes. The preacher closed his journal and looked directly into Samuel's eyes. And I think it's not finished with. The Harrow name. That afternoon, Samuel found himself back in Sheriff Blackwood's office, sharing what the preacher had told him. The sheriff listened in grim silence, occasionally nodding, as details confirmed his own suspicions. 17 families, Blackwood said finally. That's a lot of blood on one creature's hands, if it still has hands. Samuel replied, remembering the elongated limbs in Crane's drawing. They were interrupted by a commotion outside, raised voices and the sound of horses approaching at speed. Samuel looked through the window and saw a sight that made his heart sink. A family wagon pulled by exhausted horses carrying a man, woman, and 3 children, all looking road-weary and desperate. New arrivals, Blackwood observed, and both men knew without speaking what that meant. Samuel rushed outside with the sheriff close behind. The family patriarch was a sturdy man with calloused hands and kind eyes, introducing himself as Benjamin Clark, a carpenter from Virginia, seeking land and opportunity on the frontier. His wife Sarah held an infant while 2 older children clung to her skirts. We heard there might be work here, Clark said hopefully. Maybe some land we could claim. We have tools, and we're not afraid of hard labor. Samuel opened his mouth to warn them, but before he could speak, a familiar voice cut through the afternoon air. Benjamin Clark. Well, I'll be blessed. Everyone turned to see Ezekiel approaching on horseback, his gaunt frame somehow managing to look welcoming despite everything Samuel now knew about him. His brother's smile was warm and genuine, and for a moment, Samuel wondered if he had imagined all the horror of the past few days. Ezekiel Harrow Clark replied with obvious relief, "You got my letter." "Then I did indeed," Ezekiel said, dismounting and embracing the carpenter like an old friend. "And you arrived at the perfect time. We're preparing for the autumn gathering and could use skilled hands like yours." Samuel felt the world tilt around him as the terrible truth became clear. This wasn't random. These families weren't just unlucky victims. They were being invited, lured by letters and promises of work and land. The gathering is tomorrow night. Ezekiel continued, addressing the entire Clark family. "Sarah, you remember my letters about the harvest feast? How we share everything we've preserved for winter. It's a tradition in these parts, a way of welcoming new families to the territory." Little Anna Clark, a girl no older than 5, looked up at Ezekiel with trusting eyes. "Will there be apple pie?" she asked. Ezekiel's smile widened, revealing those sharp teeth. "All the pie you can eat, little one, and games too. We have special games for children during the gathering." Samuel tried to step forward to warn them, but found he couldn't move his legs. It was as if some invisible force was holding him in place. The sheriff beside him seemed equally paralyzed. "Why don't you follow me to the homestead?" Ezekiel suggested. "The journey has been long, and Martha has prepared rooms for travelers. She's quite the cook. Our guests always leave satisfied." Benjamin Clark looked around the settlement, taking in the meager buildings and handful of residents, then back at Ezekiel's promising smile. "We'd be much obliged," he said, loading his family back into the wagon. As they prepared to leave, Ezekiel's gaze found Samuel, and for just a moment his brother's facade slipped. The thing behind his eyes was neither human nor sane, and when it smiled, saw not teeth but rows of gleaming bone. "Tomorrow night, brother," Ezekiel called, as if issuing an invitation. "You should come to the gathering. It's time you met the rest of the family." The wagon rolled away toward the forest with the Clark family chattering excitedly about their good fortune. Samuel watched until they disappeared among the trees, then turned to find Sheriff Blackwood pale and shaking. "We have to warn them," Samuel said, but his voice sounded distant, even to himself. The sheriff shook his head slowly. "We can't," he said with terrible certainty. "Whatever hold that thing has over this territory, it extends to us too. Didn't you feel it? Way your body wouldn't obey when you tried to step forward." Samuel had felt at the invisible chains that had kept him motionless while innocents were led to slaughter. But knowing they were powerless didn't make it any easier to accept. There has to be something we can do, he insisted. Blackwood was quiet for a long moment, studying the tree line where the wagon had vanished. Maybe, he said finally, but whatever we're going to do, we better do it tonight, because tomorrow he didn't need to finish. The sentence, Samuel could picture it all too clearly. The Clark family gathered around Martha's table, sharing a feast they would never finish. The children playing games they would never complete, and somewhere in the darkness his brother preparing to welcome 5 more souls into his twisted family, where love was measured in suffering and togetherness lasted forever. As midnight approached, Samuel found himself standing in the graveyard behind the settlement's church, holding a shovel and fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run back to Pennsylvania and forget he ever had a brother. Preacher Crane knelt beside a freshly dug grave, muttering prayers in a language that sounded older than Latin, older than anything that should be spoken by human tongues. The old man's hands shook as he sprinkled salt in a perfect circle around the disturbed earth. This is madness, Samuel whispered, but even as he spoke he could feel something changing in the air around them. The oppressive weight that had held him paralyzed earlier was lifting slowly like fog burning off in morning sunlight. Madness, Crane replied without looking up. Necessity. The thing that wears your brother's face draws its power from the land itself, from the bones of those who died here before us. But there are older powers, Samuel powers, that remember when this territory belonged to different gods. Sheriff Blackwood emerged from the church, carrying an armload of items that made Samuel's skin crawl. A human skull yellowed with age, iron nails driven through small wooden crosses, and a leather pouch that smelled of grave dirt and something worse. Where did you get those things? Samuel asked. Been collecting them for years, Blackwood said grimly. Ever since the first family went missing, I had a feeling normal law wouldn't be enough to stop whatever was happening out there. Crane stood and dusted off his knees. The circle is prepared, he announced. Now we need blood. Fresh blood given willingly to break the hold that creature has over this territory. Samuel felt his stomach drop. You want us to just a few drops each, the preacher assured him. But it must be given freely, no coercion, no fear. Only the willing sacrifice of those who would stand against the darkness. Blackwood was already rolling up his sleeve. I've seen what that thing does to children, he said, producing a small knife. Sheriff's oath says I protect the innocent, even if it costs me everything. Samuel watched the sheriff make a small cut on his forearm and let 3 drops of blood fall onto the salted earth. The ground seemed to absorb it immediately, and for just a moment, the air around them shimmered like heat waves rising from summer. Pavement. Your turn, Crane said, offering Samuel the knife. Samuel took the blade and drew it across his palm. The pain was sharp and clean, unlike the sick wrongness that had been eating at him since arriving in the territory. His blood joined the sheriff's, and suddenly Samuel could think clearly. For the first time in days, the creature's influence over them was broken, but breaking free came with a terrible cost. Now they could feel everything, the full weight of all those deaths, all that suffering pressing down on them like a physical thing. Samuel doubled over and vomited while Blackwood leaned against a headstone, breathing hard. Many are out there right now, Samuel gasped, wiping his mouth. Crane consulted his journal, flipping through pages with trembling fingers. If the pattern holds, the Clark family should still be alive. The thing likes to keep them for at least a day before the final ceremony. It feeds on their hope, their gradual understanding of what's going to happen to them. We have to get them out, Samuel said. But even as he spoke, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The preacher shook his head. It's not just about rescuing them, Samuel. The thing has been growing stronger with each family it takes. If we don't stop it here tonight, it will spread beyond this territory, beyond anything we can contain. What do you mean? Samuel asked, though he was afraid he already knew, have been tracking its movement for 2 years. Crane said, pointing to marks on a crude map. Illinois, Ohio, Kentucky. It's always moving west. Always following the frontier settlements where law is thin and neighbors are scarce. But lately it's been moving faster, taking more families in shorter periods of time. It's preparing for something bigger. Blackwood realized exactly the preacher's eyes held a wild light, and I think I know what. Tomorrow night isn't just another feeding, it's a ritual, a way of anchoring itself permanently to this territory. Once that's done, it won't need to move anymore. It can stay here and draw families from hundreds of miles around. Samuel felt cold, despite the warm night air. How do we stop it? Crane opened his leather pouch and pulled out something that made both men step back. A withered human hand bound with iron wire and covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. This belonged to a Shawnee medicine man who tried to stop the creature 50 years ago, the preacher explained. He failed, but not before he bound part of its essence into this relic. If we can get close enough during the ritual, if we can disrupt the ceremony at the crucial moment, we might be able to destroy it. Might, Samuel repeated. The old man's honesty was brutal. I don't know. Samuel, I'm a preacher, not a warrior. I've spent 2 years trying to understand something that shouldn't exist in God's creation. All I know is that 17 families deserve justice, and the Clark family deserves a chance. They spent the next hour preparing weapons that felt more like desperate prayers than actual tools. Silver bullets blessed by Crane and carved with symbols from his journal, iron knives wrapped in strips of cloth soaked in holy water, wooden stakes cut from trees that had never been touched by the creature's influence. As they worked, Samuel found himself thinking about Ezekiel, not the thing that wore his brother's face now, but the young man who had left Pennsylvania with dreams of building something good in the wilderness. Do you think any part of my brother is still in there? Samuel asked. Crane paused in his carving. The creature feeds on identity, Samuel. It doesn't just kill the body, it consumes everything that makes a person unique, their memories, their personality, their soul. If your brother is still alive in any meaningful way, he's trapped watching everything the creature does with his face, his voice, his memories. The thought was somehow worse than simple death. But there's something else, Crane continued. Something I didn't want to tell you before. The creature doesn't just choose its victims randomly. It has a preference for families with strong bonds, siblings who love each other, parents who would die for their children. It feeds on those connections, uses them as anchor points. Samuel understood with horrible clarity. That's why it kept Ezekiel. That's why it's calling for me. The preacher nodded grimly. Your brother loved you. Samuel, even twisted as he is, now that love is still there, somewhere still calling to you. And the creature knows that as long as you're alive, as long as you refuse to join its family willingly, it can never be completely secure in this territory. So this was never about rescuing the Clarks or stopping the creature from spreading. It was about Samuel himself, about the choice he would have to make when faced with his brother's pleading voice. Come dawn, they would ride to the homestead armed with blessed weapons and desperate hope. But Samuel knew that when the moment came, when he looked into Ezekiel's eyes and saw whatever remained of the brother he had loved, he might not be strong enough to do what needed to be done. The creature had chosen its bait well, and now it was simply waiting for Samuel to take it. The screaming started just before dawn, and Samuel knew they were already too late. He'd been riding hard through the forest with Sheriff Blackwood and Preacher Crane, following the twisted path to the Harrow homestead, when the sound reached them through the trees, high and desperate, and unmistakably the voice of a child in mortal terror. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through leaves and the hammering of Samuel's heart. We have to hurry, Crane urged, his weathered face pale in the pre-dawn light. But even as he spoke, they could all feel it, the wrongness in the air growing stronger with each step closer to the homestead. The clearing looked different in daylight, somehow smaller and more intimate, which made the horror of what they found there even worse. The Clark family wagon sat abandoned near the cabin, its contents scattered across the ground like discarded dreams, children's toys mixed with cooking pots and Benjamin Clark's carpentry tools, creating a tableau of interrupted lives. But it was the smell that stopped them cold, the same sweet, sickly odor Samuel remembered from his first visit, but stronger now and mixed with something else, something that spoke of meat left too long in the sun. The cabin door stood open, and Martha appeared in the doorway as if she had been waiting for them. Her waxy skin seemed to glow with its own pale light, and when she smiled, Samuel could see that her teeth had grown longer, sharper than any human mouth should hold. "Welcome to the gathering," she said, in that honey-glass voice. "You're just in time for the main course." Behind her, in the darkness of the cabin, Samuel could hear sounds that made his soul recoil. Wet tearing noises punctuated by soft whimpering, and something that might have been laughter. If laughter could come from the throat of something that had never been human, where are they? Samuel demanded, raising his rifle, though part of him already knew the weapon would be useless. "Where they've always been," Martha replied, tilting her head with bird-like curiosity. "Part of the family now. Part of something bigger and more beautiful than their small mortal lives could ever have been." Blackwood had his pistol drawn, but his hand was shaking so badly, Samuel wondered if the man could hit anything at all. The sheriff's face was gray with horror and understanding. "The children," he whispered. "Oh, the children are special," Martha said, and her smile widened until it seemed to split her face in half. "They adapt so quickly to their new nature, much faster than the adults who cling to their old selves, like drowning men clutching driftwood." A figure emerged from the cabin behind Martha, and Samuel's breath caught in his throat. It was Benjamin Clark, or what had been Benjamin Clark. The carpenter's sturdy frame was still recognizable, but everything else was wrong. His skin had the same waxy quality as Martha's. His eyes held that terrible, hungry intelligence, and when he opened his mouth, Samuel saw rows of needle-sharp teeth. Benjamin held something in his arms, something small and still that might once have been his youngest child, Sarah Clark, followed carrying what remained of the infant, both parents moving with the jerky, unnatural gait of marionettes, controlled by invisible strings. "The transformation isn't complete yet," Martha explained, as if discussing the weather. "They still remember. Their old lives still feel echoes of what they used to call love. But that will fade in time. Everything fades except the hunger." Samuel felt bile rising in his throat. "Where is my brother?" "Right here." Ezekiel's voice came from behind them, and all three men spun around to find him standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked almost normal in the morning light, almost like the brother Samuel remembered, except for his eyes, which held depths that seemed to go on forever. "Been waiting for you, Samuel," Ezekiel said with genuine warmth in his voice. "I knew you'd come. I knew you couldn't stay away from family." Samuel raised his rifle, but found he couldn't pull the trigger. Something in his brother's expression, in the familiar cadence of his voice, held him paralyzed. "You don't understand yet," Ezekiel continued, stepping closer. "What we've become, what we can offer you. It's not death, Samuel. It's transformation. It's belonging to something greater than yourself." Behind Ezekiel, more figures emerged from the forest. The Whitmore family, or what they had become. John Whitmore's blacksmith arms now ended in claws that could rend metal. His wife Patience carried the head of their son Thomas like a beloved doll, while little Anna Whitmore skipped alongside them, humming a children's song in a voice like breaking glass. All the family, Samuel realized with growing horror. All of them transformed into this obscene parody of human life. "We keep them together," Ezekiel said, as if reading his thoughts. "Families are sacred, Samuel. They shouldn't be separated by something as trivial as death." Preacher Crane stepped forward, clutching his leather pouch. "This is abomination," he shouted. "These souls deserve rest, not this twisted mockery of existence." Ezekiel's gaze shifted to the old preacher, and when he smiled, Samuel saw something that made him understand finally and completely that his brother was gone. Whatever wore his face now was something else entirely. "Ah, the traveling preacher," Ezekiel said with mock courtesy. "You've been quite troublesome, haven't you? Spreading your little stories, warning people away from our hospitality." Crane opened his pouch and pulled out the withered hand bound with iron wire, the symbols carved into. The desiccated flesh began to glow with a cold blue light that made all the transformed creatures step back. "This ends now," Crane declared, raising the relic high. But as he spoke, Martha moved faster than anything human should be able to move. Her claws raked across the preacher's throat, and he fell backward, blood spraying across the morning air. The withered hand rolled away from his dying grasp, and Martha crushed it under her heel with a sound like breaking. Bones the cymbals flared once and died, leaving only dust and the echo of power that might have been salvation. No Crane gasped with his last breath, reaching toward Samuel. You have to, but the preacher's final words were lost in a gurgle of blood, and then there was only silence except for the sound of Samuel's ragged breathing. Sheriff raised his pistol and fired 3 shots into Martha's chest. The blessed bullet struck her with flashes of silver light, but she only laughed and kept walking forward. Her wounds sealed themselves before Blackwood could reload. You cannot kill what was never truly alive, she said, reaching for him with those terrible claws. Samuel watched in frozen horror as Martha lifted the sheriff off his feet. Her fingers punctured his throat, and something dark began flowing between them. Blackwood's struggles grew weaker as his life force drained away, feeding the creature that had once pretended to be human. When she finally let him fall, the sheriff's eyes had already begun to change now. There's just you and me, brother, Ezekiel said, and his voice held all the love and warmth Samuel remembered from their childhood. Just family the way it should be. Samuel looked around the clearing at the grotesque parody of domestic life that surrounded him, at children who would never grow older, adults who would never find peace and love, twisted into something hungry and eternal. His rifle felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Join us, Samuel, Ezekiel pleaded, and for just a moment he looked like the brother who had left Pennsylvania full of hope and dreams. We can be together forever. We can be a real family at last. Samuel closed his eyes and tried to remember what Ezekiel had been like before whatever lived in these woods had claimed him. Tried to hold on to the memory of a young man who had wanted nothing more than to build something good in the wilderness. When he opened them again, his brother was still waiting, patient and loving and utterly damned. Samuel finally understood what he had to do. Samuel pulled the trigger and watched his brother's face dissolve into something that had never been human at all. Blessed bullet struck Ezekiel's center mass, and the thing wearing his brother's skin began to unravel like a tapestry pulled apart by invisible hands. The familiar features melted away, revealing something ancient and hungry underneath, something with too many teeth and eyes that held the accumulated suffering of 63 souls. But even as the creature writhed and screamed in voices that belonged to all the families it had consumed, Samuel could hear his brother's voice among them, faint and desperate and heartbreakingly real. Thank you, the voice whispered. Thank you for setting me free. The other transformed beings began to collapse as well, their borrowed humanity falling away like shed skin. Martha's waxy flesh cracked and peeled, revealing something that might have been woman once but had been hollowed out and filled with darkness. The Clark family crumpled into themselves, their brief resurrection ending in merciful silence. Only Sheriff Blackwood remained standing, but his eyes were clearing as the creature's hold over him weakened. The transformation had barely begun, and with its source destroyed, the process reversed itself, leaving him gasping and human and alive. Samuel lowered his rifle and walked to where the thing that had been his brother lay dying. Its true form was terrible to look at, something that belonged in the deepest nightmares of children who had never seen sunlight. But as Samuel watched the creature's death throes, he saw faces in its dissolving flesh, the faces of everyone it had consumed, all of them finally at peace. The Whitmore children smiled as they faded away. Their parents reached for each other one last time before finding the rest they had been denied. Benjamin and Sarah Clark held their babies close as the family dissolved into morning mist. Even Martha's features softened as whatever she had been before the creature claimed her was finally allowed to die. But it was Ezekiel's face that appeared last, rising from the melting horror like a swimmer breaking the surface of a dark lake. His eyes were clear and human and full of the love Samuel remembered from their childhood. Sorry, he said, and his voice was his own again. I tried to fight it, Samuel. I tried so hard, but it was so hungry, and I was so alone. I know, Samuel whispered, kneeling beside his brother's fading form. I know you fought it. Tell Mother, Ezekiel said, growing fainter with each word. Tell her I tried to build something good out here. Tell her I tried to make her proud. Samuel nodded. though he could barely see through his tears. "I'll tell her, and Samuel." Ezekiel's voice was barely a whisper now. "Don't let them bury me in this place. Burn everything. Burn the cabin, burn the fields, burn it all so nothing can grow here again." Samuel promised and meant it. Ezekiel smiled one last time, and then he was gone. Not just the creature, but his brother as well, finally free from the prison of corrupted flesh that had held him for 2 terrible years. Sheriff Blackwood helped Samuel gather kindling and oil from the cabin. Together they set fire to everything: the buildings, the fields, even the barrels in the root cellar that held the preserved remains of the creature's victims. The flames rose high and hot, burning away 2 years of horror and leaving only clean ashes as they watched the homestead burn. Samuel told Blackwood about Preacher Crane's journal about the other settlements that might have been touched by similar darkness. The sheriff nodded grimly and promised to send warnings to every territory marshal he knew, but Samuel knew it wouldn't be enough. Creatures like this one didn't just appear from nothing. They were called into being by human greed and isolation and desperation. As long as there were lonely homesteads and desperate families, there would always be something waiting in the darkness to offer them belonging at a price too terrible to imagine. 3 days later, Samuel stood at his parents' grave in the Pennsylvania cemetery where he had grown up. The headstones were simple granite markers that spoke of lives lived quietly and ended peacefully. He had added a 3rd stone between them, a marker for Ezekiel, Harrow's beloved son and brother, who had died trying to build something good in the wilderness. Samuel had told his mother the truth about Ezekiel's death, not the whole truth, but enough. She had wept for her lost son and thanked Samuel for bringing him home, even if home was only a memory carved in stone. Now Samuel stood alone in the gathering dusk, reading the names on the headstones and wondering if he had done the right thing. He could have joined his brother, could have accepted the creature's offer of eternal family, and never known loneliness again. But as he turned to leave, he saw a figure approaching through the cemetery. A young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, who introduced herself as Mary Whitmore and explained that she was John Whitmore's sister, come to Pennsylvania after receiving word of her brother's disappearance in the Indiana Territory. She had been looking for someone who might know what happened to John's family. Samuel told her the truth as gently as he could, that her brother and his wife and children had died peacefully in their sleep from a fever that swept through the territory, that they had been buried with dignity and remembered with love. Mary wept for her lost family, but she thanked Samuel for his kindness and asked if he might walk with her back to town. She was alone now, with no family left, and the prospect of traveling back to Virginia by herself seemed overwhelming. Samuel offered her his arm, and as they walked through the darkening cemetery, he felt something he hadn't experienced since before this all began: a connection to another human being that wasn't built on hunger or need or the terrible gravity of shared damnation. Just the simple comfort of 2 people who had both lost everything, finding solace in each other's company. Behind them, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of distant smoke and the memory of flames that had burned away more than just wood and flesh. They had burned away a piece of Samuel's soul, but they had also burned away the last traces of something that should never have existed in the first place. As Samuel and Mary disappeared into the growing darkness, the cemetery settled into peaceful silence. The dead rested quietly in their graves, dreaming whatever dreams the departed are allowed. And in the Indiana Territory, where a homestead had once stood, nothing grew for 7 years, until finally the forest reclaimed the cursed ground, covering the ashes with new green life that held no memory of the horrors that had come before. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows just right through those reclaimed woods, travelers report hearing voices calling from beneath the earth. Voices that sound like family calling their loved ones home. And sometimes, just sometimes, someone is foolish enough or desperate enough or lonely enough to follow those voices into the darkness, where families are forever and love never dies and the harvest never truly ends.